To just get started, I'd like you to meet the gentleman who is the namesake for today's keynote address.
Dale was in charge of the copy desk, where the tension often reached its peak, and he was a well, how to put this? Dale was not a sort of warm and fuzzy person.
He was awful. He was mean. He had very little patience with students. He had one student came back after he'd been out in the field and came back, and he walked up to Dale and he, in very unkind language, said, "I hated you, but I want to thank you." To Dale, that was one of the nicest compliments. Having it right was the requirement of everything, having it right.
Later, when he moved off the copy desk and into the classroom to teach law and advise graduate students, he became, I think it's fair to say, much more beloved.
Today we're going to talk about the tools that you're going to be using if you stay in this business the rest of your life.
He was the first weatherman on KOMU. And at that time, the weatherboard was a blackboard, had a map of the United States on it with all the states. He thoroughly enjoyed it.
He did a remarkable thing, which was, while working full-time, helping Joy to raise their daughters, he managed to somehow fit in a law school education and then became the journalism school's media law expert and became a real authority in that field and spoke at seminars around the country, wrote a comm law textbook.
He was probably the first journalism professor who put such emphasis on the value of knowing the law for journalists. That was really his love.
I don't think Dale actually tried many cases, though he was the Missourians' attorney, among other things. What he was a worker in the trenches, a person who taught the values of freedom of information and free expression and the First Amendment individually in the classroom and for a good many years to a lot of conferences of investigative reporters and editors. He came to be highly regarded by the IRE membership and was looked to as a reliable source and legal advisor on a pro bono basis.
He was a great advocate, a great admirer of Justice Black of the Supreme Court, who is the First Amendment, was the real advocate of the First Amendment. And he had had a wonderful visit with Justice Black, talking about the First Amendment, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. That was Dale's, he loved it.
Today, the University of Missouri and the City of Columbia lost a noted professor and former weatherman. Dale Spencer established a national reputation in the field of communications law. He died early today from a massive heart attack at the age of 63.
He would take up any new subject that came along and even know the last word on it, what the Supreme Court had to say about it, and quote it letter and verse. You can hardly find people like that. And probably not. How are you going to replace Dale Spencer on the faculty?
Dale Spencer was one of those people who touched more lives, more importantly, than probably he ever even realized.
And that's all for today on the television part.
Please welcome Dale Spencer's daughter, Melinda Machonis.
Good afternoon. It is an honor to be here with all of you today. Before I start my remarks, I'd just like to say a couple of thank yous to Drew Griffith and Kim Bunting for all the work that they did in helping us make this just tribute and this luncheon happen today. Also, I don't know if she's watching through this video, through the screening, but Olga Masari, who actually did the videotaping, and also George Kennedy, Pam Johnson, and most especially Roger Gaffke, who knew my father and have really helped us put this endowment together and make it a reality. And so I just wanted to acknowledge them. But I'd like to take a few minutes and talk a little bit about my father beyond the journalist who you saw there, and wrap that a little bit into what we view and our vision for the endowment. You saw the professional side of him there. Unfortunately, we were able to see it ahead of time, so my tears got out of the way. And but I wanted to. He worked very hard to integrate his family with his job and his profession with his family. And I really think it started the day I was born. He was a weatherman at the time. He had the blackboard and the chalk. And that evening, he used that piece of chalk with the map to explain that there was good weather on the West Coast, a front coming out of the mountains, rain over the middle part of this country, and a low-pressure system off the East Coast. And before he was done, he had the word girl written across the map, and he announced my birth. A number of years later, after he had finished law school and was really starting to integrate the First Amendment passion with his journalism and his law, we had the opportunity to have Bob Woodward visit our home and spend an evening talking to my dad and having drinks out on the deck. And I met him at the time, and frankly, no offense, I couldn't care less. I was a teenager at the time, and it really didn't mean anything. But my dad liked to have us meet these people. It was part of who he was. But I'll tell you, a few years later, when they started to film All the President's Men with Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford, I thought it'd be great if they included that scene from the movie in the movie and shot it on location. But they didn't do that. He also, and it wasn't mentioned in the video, he also was an expert witness for a number of cases that were tried around the country. And he was very passionate about that. I remember early on when he started traveling, my mother said, "Dale, what are you charging for this?" And he told her, and she goes, "How can you charge so much money?" And a few months later, this case was written up in a magazine, and it talked about the big city attorneys who were expert witnesses on the other side and all the money they made, and this small-town professor from the University of Missouri and how little he charged. And my mother goes, "Dale, why didn't you charge more?" But actually, that's a segue for me. For him, it wasn't about the money. It was about taking those stories and being part of those stories and being part of those cases and bringing them back to his students. Being able to tell firsthand what had happened in those cases because he was involved in them. That was his passion, and that's what we want to create with this endowment. To be able to have the attorneys or the judges or justices or the people that are involved in pushing the envelope to come talk to the students and share their stories and their trials, their challenges in this. That's what we want to do. So often, since he's been gone, we would hear about something on public radio or in the newspaper about the First Amendment case happening. And my husband and I, and my mother and I go, "I wonder what Daddy would have said about that." And so it's those sorts of cases, those sorts of topics that we really want to bring to the students with this. The first one that really hit me recently was bong hits for Jesus. I just think that'd be a great one for the students to get a kick out of. But it's First Amendment, and it's got some interesting stories to it. The Twitter, the reporter that uses Twitter to get information from a situation that's happening. He died before the internet happened, but I know that Missouri is already dealing with the internet. Even right now, the recent situation, wouldn't it be interesting to have someone from the White House come talk to the students about the dilemma they went through, the decisions they looked at in releasing the photos of bin Laden? Those are the sorts of things I'd like to give the students the opportunity through this endowment. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have Mr. Bass here today talking about his experiences with what he's doing in support of this and the fact that it's being streamed and videoed so that, again, the students can see it. It's very consistent with what we envisioned for the endowment, and I'm thrilled to have him here today. So thank you very much.
Your program shows that Lucy Douglas is supposed to be standing here now. I obviously am not Lucy Douglas. She's taller. Among other things. It will become obvious in a few minutes why Lucy and I switched assignments, and you will learn in a few minutes the reason for doing that. It just happened too late to change it in the program, so we're doing that away. Our keynote speaker, Gary Bass, should need no introduction to this group, even though he's more focused on the federal level and folks in this room are focused on the state level. He needs no introduction, and if he needs one, there's a nice one printed in your program, and so I refer you to that. But Gary founded the governmental watchdog group OMB Watch 28 years ago. Under his tenure, OMB Watch has become a prominent nonprofit research and advocacy organization promoting greater government accountability and transparency, which, as we all understand in this room, leads to increased citizen participation in their government. Although he's an expert on federal budgetary, program management, regulatory, and information policy issues, he's also a notorious ringleader who has spurred other nonprofits to fight back against government secrecy. Shortly after 9/11, he assembled an eclectic group of nonprofit leaders to create openthegovernment.org in an effort to keep Congress and the Bush administration from shutting the American people out of the operations of their government. In 2008, when it looked like there might finally be an opportunity to influence the incoming presidential administration, he was relentless in using his encyclopedic knowledge and understanding of the executive branch to mobilize other nonprofits into a unified force for transparency. In March, Bass led the first meeting of open government advocates with a sitting United States, to sit down with a sitting United States president. That was a remarkable achievement. Bass has published extensively, testified before Congress, appeared on national television, and presented to groups across the country. He's an expert at using newer information technologies to empower citizen and community groups to challenge unchecked institutional power. His list of accomplishments is long, but Bass is remarkable for a very special reason. Unlike some territorial competitive nonprofit leaders intent on stifling what they perceive to be competition in fundraising and other areas, Gary Bass is generous and inclusive. Basically, like everybody in this room, he's a coalition builder. He cares about the public's right to know, and he understands that the public is better served when we all work together. Bass is leaving OMB Watch for a new challenge. He is the new chief executive of the Bowman Family Foundation, also in Washington, which has largely the same mission as OMB Watch. But he'll see the world from a different perspective. Instead of scraping for money, he'll be giving it away. And for that, I for one can say I'm quite jealous. Ladies and gentlemen, Gary Bass.
That's a far generous introduction. I was just thinking when you were doing that, and I'm somewhat embarrassed by all the positives you said, but I was thinking just a couple of weeks ago I was being introduced in another town by someone and finished with, and the person says, and now the bad news from Washington, D.C. He points to me. I didn't quite know, was he saying I'm bad news or the information I was bringing was bad news? So I appreciate the positive. It's also, Melinda, an honor to be the inaugural talk for your father. I didn't know him, and the video was absolutely wonderful. But my take on it is he's a champion for government openness, which all of us in this room are also strong advocates for. And so in the spirit of that kind of championing, advocacy, if you will, for an open government, I thought it may be picking up on what you said of what would your dad say. We should be thinking in this kind of dialogue today around what would Dale Spencer say. Now, certainly we could look at government openness from his passing, and it's a remarkable change. As Melinda said, the internet wasn't even present in 1988. What a change. Those of us who were working on freedom of information were in one world, while others who were dealing with what is broadly called right to know was in another world. And they were all parallel tracks. Journalists were running down one track, the advocacy groups for government openness, separate parallel tracks. And today, it is remarkable how much has changed. We are one. We have worked together. The notion of freedom of information being over here and sort of right to know being over here is a false dichotomy. So much has changed. And then we turn around to the Obama administration and we think a little bit about where are we at today. And we could spend a lot of time this afternoon talking about is the glass half full, is the glass half empty, and we could each make arguments on the glass half full. There's new policies at the federal level, some of which have migrated down to the state. There's new use of technology. There's cultural change within the federal government. On that glass half empty, you all could probably fill it up very quickly. And every one of us in this room could talk about gaps in policy. We could talk about great policy, but the implementation has been poor. We could go through all of that. But I think there was a quote that I think it was one of his students said. There was a whole list of accolades. And the one that grabbed me was a quote that said, he demanded more because he thought I could handle it. And so what I want to use my time today is to talk about demanding of all of us, me included, more of us. Because we can handle it. We lurch from one open government crisis to another, whether it's the morning sets of panels on coalitions or whether it's around state laws. We lurch from one thing to another. And I think what we should try to do today is begin, instead of calling this the Dale Spencer inaugural talk, let's call it the inaugural dialogue. Because what I want to try and do is kick off a discussion around where do we want to be? Where do we want to go? And then start, how do we get there? There's maybe it's, I'll say a story, maybe it's apocryphal, I don't know. It's about Albert Einstein. There's a story that Einstein was on the train and a conductor came along to get the ticket. You know how they come along and click the tickets? Conductor comes along and says, "Sir, could I have your ticket?" And Einstein starts searching his pockets and then his briefcase, can't find the ticket. And all of a sudden the conductor realizes it's Albert Einstein and says, "Oh, Professor Einstein, it's okay, you don't need a ticket. You can ride, for free." And Einstein starts to get down on all fours and look under the seat, and he's looking through his books for the ticket. And the conductor says, "Really, Dr. Einstein, it's okay." And Einstein says, "You don't understand. I need to find the ticket to know where I'm going." And I think we need the ticket today. We need to lay out a map of where we want to be so that we can determine whether or not we're getting anywhere. So it's in that spirit that I would like to try the beginnings of this dialogue. Obviously, I'm not smart enough to have the answers for everything, but I want to try and reflect some of the things all of us in this room have been talking about and put it into a few points. And the way I'd like to try and do it is sort of two parts. One I'll call first principles, and the other is how do we get there? And I promise to keep it to only 5 points under each, because I can't remember more than 5 points, let alone you all just eating food and wondering how far is he going to go. So with that in mind, let me start with the first principles. And in that context, the first principle that we all, I hope, would agree on is that we want government, and I'm referring to all governments, local, state, federal, to move towards an affirmative obligation to make information available to the public. Now, I say that as a principle because what we have today is a model premised on what I call the outdated, outmoded freedom of information model, a requester-driven model that puts the burden on the public to demand or request information from government, instead of the burden being on government to voluntarily, not just voluntarily, but affirmatively and required to disclose information. So the first principle is that information should be available in searchable web formats, not just data, but information. And the moniker, I would say, or the clause or the slogan is FOIA should become our vehicle of last resort instead of the first resort. That's the first principle. Second principle, which is a corollary, is we need to still strengthen and protect a safety net of laws to ensure we have access. So we need a stronger freedom of information at the state level and at the federal level. We need to have stronger whistleblower protections. We need stronger and protected media shield. We need the openness laws that exist in the state and federal to be strengthened, whether they be around open meetings or other kinds of openness laws. They are essential. The freedom of information model that we just heard about in the last panel can be extremely frustrating if you're not a lawyer or if you're not knowledgeable about how to use all the mechanisms to file a request. Hence, the first principle, that it should be publicly accessible, prevails. Okay, third point. Information technology is incredibly important to all of us, but it's not a panacea. It's simply a tool. And we've got to keep that in mind, because what happens is when we rave about the information technology, the government's response is to give us a website and walk away. The solution isn't at the federal level a data.gov, and it's certainly not at the state levels just creating a recovery.gov. What we really need is to harness technology in a way to empower us to maximize potential. That's the third point. The fourth point on a first principle is we need to start looking holistically again. We have become far too entrenched, in my view, of working on state issues, working on federal issues. You know, if we're using information technologies in the right way, the day should be where, when you're, say, filing reports, you shouldn't, as a non-governmental entity that has requirements to file reports, you shouldn't have to file a state report, a local report, a federal report, all being different. We should create one kind of system. And then, if you have one kind of system, the access points become much more easy to deal with. You have less inconsistencies of the data and the information. But we don't think in those terms because of the multiple governmental structures that are out there. But as a first principle, as in a long-term objective, it seems to me that we need to start thinking about this kind of holistic approach. And it seems also to me that there's a right place for those of us working at the state level, and there's a right place for us working at the federal level. For example, when President Obama created the recovery.gov website where we could get the Recovery Act data, do you realize, even though it wasn't mandated by law, every state created an equivalent website? The peer pressure was pretty intense to create that. Similarly, the state areas where experimentation can occur can migrate up to the federal level. For example, right now, President Obama has a draft executive order on disclosure of political contributions for bidding contractors at the federal level. Well, the idea came directly from states, where that model was already out there and was being built off of. So we need to start thinking of ourselves as symbiotic in ways that we haven't necessarily, we've talked about it, but we need to keep that as a first principle. And finally, as a fifth point of principles, I would acknowledge that some things need to be secret. Now, the hard part of that is defining it. But I think that's the kind of challenge we should be talking about here, so that it isn't creeping and doesn't become pervasive. We need to have a solid definition of what is legitimately secret material, and what is pseudo-secrecy, if you will, what is being foisted under that. So those 5 principles help me to start thinking about where do we want to go. Now, I say this with the notion that those 5 points, you all probably have 5 more, or you may disagree with those 5. And that's why I'm approaching this as a beginning dialogue. I'm not suggesting I have all the answers on those 5, or even that they are completely the right ones. But I want to put them out there because I think we've got to start as a community thinking about these bigger pictures where we want to be. So if you buy into those 5, it leads me to 5 ideas of moving forward. First, it suggests to me that what we should be talking about today, as a first thing, is any time any government, local, state, federal, proposes collecting information from the public, any part of the public, the requirement of that proposal has to include a dissemination model. As simple as that. At the federal level, a way to achieve it would be we have something called the Paperwork Reduction Act, where any kind of information collection requirement that comes out has to be cleared by the Office of Management and Budget. Well, why don't we impose as a requirement that any agency proposal to do that also include how it will be disseminated to the public? What's the means, what material, what information will be disclosed, how it will be disclosed, how timely? All the issues that we care about and have been talked about this morning should be part of that proposal from day one. The second point of moving forward is not all information is the same. So we have a system in place today where we talk about, those of us who are in this community, we talk about access to information. But there's a vast difference between information that is, say, mission-oriented to the agency, to the government agency, versus information that's about accountability of that agency. We tend to talk, not us in this room, but we in the broader universe, tend to talk about openness mostly in the mission-driven sense. That is, we get access to information about what the mission of the agency is. At the federal level, it might be something like the Toxics Release Inventory that's done by EPA, where it gives information to the public to help use that to make decisions or to be advised. You can do it about consumer products. You can do it about a whole range of things. What is often left out is what was talked about this morning in the panel just we came from, which is information about making our government more accountable. In that context, my second point is to propose that we develop, I'll call it a floor. This is a minimum standard that all agencies in our government, federal, state, local, have a requirement and the affirmative obligation that I mentioned earlier as a principle to make available to the public. You can go beyond that floor, but at a minimum, this must be done universally. Examples of what should be in this floor We all can make up our, I have a long list, by the way, and many of us in Washington, D.C. who have been working together have been refining and developing this list over the last year. But there are things like, well, an example might be a directory of employees who work for the government and how you reach them. Some states do that, some don't. The federal level, some agencies do, some don't. Another example, the calendars of all senior level government employees and visitor logs, ethics reports, inspector general reports. Those very basic things that we all have to struggle to get should be listed as core items as part of a floor that disclosure should be occurring on. There should be no buts, ands, or ifs. It is a requirement under this new model that we want to strive to have every agency across every level of government make this available in an affirmative way. And going back to Karen Kaiser's point this morning, I would say we need to make it especially clear that it doesn't matter whether it's electronic records or not electronic records. Okay. And by the way, again, my point would be that every one of us in this room could come up with our list of items that go into the floor. For me, for example, my area, I'm mostly interested in budgetary information, contracts, not just the fact that the money went out the door, but I want to see the original contract compared to the request for proposal. Non-redacted, if there's confidential information, fine, let's set up a system to redact those that are truly confidential. Each of you probably have your item. We should put the best of our brains together and come up with a smart, strategic, and reasonable floor. Okay, so first point is, from the birth of a collection of information, it should be disclosed. The second is we need a floor that says, at a minimum, all these things are affirmatively disclosed. The third point is mostly at a federal level, but it has ramifications for the state. And that is, we need to begin to address more thoughtfully how we handle national security secrecy. And I say that at least in 3 different ways. At a first point, it is clear that far too much information is classified. So the first step is we should be putting our energies as a unified community to make sure that our federal government has a better and a smarter classification system, so only those things that are really supposed to be secret are secret. And as President Obama said in his recent executive order, nothing remains secret forever. A second point under this issue is there's a whole arena that everybody in this room has dealt with around the pseudo classification area. Was it, the buzzword at the federal level is controlled unclassified information. There's a whole alphabet soup out there of what we call these things. What's some of them sensitive but unclassified, and there's a whole bunch of these. Yeah, there's a bunch of these. I mean, we could literally create, a nice alphabet soup meal. There is an executive order on that at the federal level. We need to make sure this is a moment in time that it gets implemented in the right way. And the third area of national security seems to me that deals with state secrets. There has been at most this much difference between the way, say, President Bush and President Obama has handled state secrets. In fact, President Obama campaigned and also talked about, during his presidency, creating the venue for things like in-camera review of requested privileged material so that judges could determine whether or not it warrants such categorization, such privilege. We have not seen that. So these kinds of areas, we as a community need to really push if we're going to have the right kind of information available. And of course, there's ramifications if the feds do this kind of overclassification, then it filters right on down to the state level. and a whole slew of information runs into the same barrier. Okay, so that's my third area, which is the national security. My fourth area is that we need to really work on improving the quality of the information that is disclosed to us. What's the old adage? Garbage in, garbage out? You know, if we make all this effort with a grand scheme of a plan for much greater open government, and in fact what we get back is either incomplete or inaccurate information, it doesn't do us very much good. Now, it may be that we still seek the information, but one of our strategies should be ultimately, in the long run, not simply the access, but getting the access to then come back and improve the quality so that we have better information. It may be a multi-staged process is what I'm suggesting. But we have got to find strategies for improving the quality. Connected to that, it seems to me that in today's era of information technology, and going on my first principle that it is a tool, it seems that if we are going to effectively talk about a whole vision, we're going to have to come up with a scheme for linking different data sets. In the vernacular today, it's find ways to mash up data. But to do that requires a much more thoughtful system for, say, coming up with identifiers for parent companies, for headquarters, for facilities, so that we can link the ACME in this database with the ACME in this database. Until we can do that, we are hamstrung with ever really creating a unified and holistic approach to open government. So it's the quality of the information, it is the foundational materials that make access, which I'll call, say, unique identifiers. And as I suggested when I was talking about the first principles, it seems to me we need a third piece in the data quality side, and that is we need to start thinking about information collections that aren't just local, state, or federal. And I'm thinking of that in the context of even something like the Recovery Act that many of us have just gone through, where, great, we got access to a lot of information, but in no situation ever that I saw did the state level website that had information match up with the federal level website that had information. It drove community groups, journalists, investigators, everyone just batty. What was right? That's the kind of thing we've got to start to think about avoiding. So our job as open government advocates isn't simply to let government come up with the reporting mechanisms. We need to assert ourselves so that we create the right kind of reporting mechanisms so we get the right kind of information ultimately. My fifth point, and by the way, I often say you got to have 5 points because you can keep counting them on one hand and still pound with your other hand. Those of you old enough might say, you know, Khrushchev would take his shoe off and do it, so you have a free hand, whatever. The fifth point seems to me that we need to, especially in light of what I heard in the last panel, we need to be thinking collectively about how to enforce the first 4 points. It seems to me that we need to be thinking about what are the tools available to us collectively, not just at state by state and have the uniqueness of one state versus another, or at the federal level, for creating a mechanism that we hold our government accountable for all these kinds of future visions of openness. Is it the right to sue? Is it an ombudsman, as it was talked about by Chip this morning? Is it other kinds of approaches? Some are voluntary that people have talked about. Some have said, why do we not evaluate government employees when they go through their evaluations on some of the basis about openness? Maybe that's a model. But we have to collectively start talking about what works, what makes sense, what can we put in place so that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we come back together and we talk about there has been substantial change. it isn't just picking out what Dale Spencer would have seen in 1988 to today. We need some hardcore metrics, some hardcore vision, some hardcore maps of where we want to be so we can determine whether we're getting any progress. And that leads me to not a 6 point, since I've already used up 5, but maybe a kind of concluding comment, which is that some time ago, I had the opportunity, a few of us, to have a personal interaction with then Senator Barack Obama. And the reason we were in to see him in his office was to ask him to go to bat for a particular issue. And we knew it was going to be an easy sell because he was supporting this issue anyways, but we had to ask him. And his comment was refreshing in the sense that politicians don't usually say this. He said back, "You need to make me do it." And it hit me like lightning in that meeting. That's our job. We need to make the politicians do it. We're not just here to just litigate. We're not just here to build coalitions. We're here to change the course of the way things work. You know, there's an old joke in D.C. that you can tell the politicians in town, because they're the people who have their finger up, they're testing which way the wind blows. Our job is to change the direction the wind blows. That's what we're about. We have enormous challenges in front of us. This coalition, NFOIC, is a powerful, powerful unit. We don't think of it that way because we're always struggling to raise money. But when you look around this room and the connections we each have, the reach we can bring, we suddenly look at ourselves as a power base. And we have got to do that if we're going to create a roadmap for government openness. At the same time, we've got to be introspective. What does it take to make us stronger? How do we link with national coalitions with state coalitions? How do we start to think about reaching out to the various issue groups that many of you in different state coalitions have already done? How do we speak a language that isn't so mired in our language that it resonates with other issue-based groups? We've got to take a fresh look at this if we're going to be successful. We are advocates at heart, and we can create change. We have already done enormous amount of change. You look back 10 years, and every one of us, whatever state it is, and I can speak at the federal level, we have done a remarkable job as a community with very limited resources. And we can do much, much more. In the spirit of Dale Spencer, I don't think the challenge should be what would he say, it's what would he do now. What he would probably do, and what I've read about, is he would take this kind of discussion that we're going to start, and if you will, put it through the virtual copy room to edit it, refine it, get it right. That's what we should be doing. Let's put it through our virtual room and get it right. Thanks.
I am Lucy Dalglish. I'm the taller one. I'm from Washington, and I'm so pleased that, for the last 11 years since I've been in Washington, I've been blessed with an opportunity that you've now just had, and that is to listen to Gary Bass and his points and subpoints. And I've sat around the table with him so many times. He always has points and subpoints. I've learned to be much more organized in my thinking since knowing Gary. Anyway, I've given many introductions in my life, but this one is particularly hard because I want to do it right. 32 years ago this week, I started as an intern at the St. Paul Dispatch. I was 20 years old and scared speechless. I remember standing by the elevator one day, and this very nice man came up to me and said, "Oh, hi, you're Lucy Dalglish. So nice to meet you. I knew your grandfather. And welcome to the Dispatch and the Pioneer Press. I hope you enjoy your summer." And I thought, well, that was a very nice man. And it took me a couple of weeks to figure out that was actually the boss. And that, you know, how in newsrooms nobody has a first and a last name. You go by your last name. So I learned that that was Finnegan. And for the next 10 years, I was lucky to work for Finnegan. And as good as he was in the newsroom, as the executive editor, it became clear that he commanded incredible respect elsewhere in the state of Minnesota. When he spoke, lawmakers listened. And that was partly because he helped draft the state open records meeting, or open meetings, I'm sorry. He helped draft the state open meetings law in 1957. And he drafted and helped lobby for the state open records law, which we call the Data Practices Act in Minnesota. That was in 1974. And when that law needed enforcing, he didn't hesitate to sue people for it. After retirement in 1989, he continued to be president of the Minnesota Joint Media Committee, supporting open government throughout the state. Jack Finnegan was like many of us. He was one of those kids who wanted to tell people what was going on in the world. The first evidence I uncovered about his need to inform his community was in 6th grade. He wrote for his class newspaper at St. Stephen's School in Minneapolis. And one time he even did a man-on-the-street column interviewing his fellow students about their reaction to the Hindenburg explosion in 1937. He kept at it during World War II when he wrote about his infantry serving in Europe. He kept at it after the war when he went to journalism school at the University of Minnesota on the GI Bill. He reported in Rochester and in St. Paul before becoming an editor. But he knew that to be a good reporter, you needed good information. And he inspired several of us in this room to become open government advocates. For those efforts, he has been elected to the National Freedom of Information Act Hall of Fame in Washington in 2001. He was president of the First Amendment Congress. He has been vice president of the American Society of News Editors FOI Committee. And he has been chairman of the Associated Press Managing Editors FOI Committee. And today, the Freedom of Information Coalition and the Society of Professional Journalists are pleased to join those groups in honoring John R. Finnegan Sr. by putting him on the roster of the State Open Government Hall of Fame. So, Jack?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've never been called a hero before. I want to thank all of you very, very much for this great honor. I didn't expect to be here today. I got on the plane last night, and we were told that Providence was fogged in, and we probably wouldn't be able to land. Fortunately, 15 minutes later, the pilot said we're free to go. So we landed here about 11:30 last night, which is why I wasn't here earlier for this beginning of this meeting. I'm very grateful to the Minnesota Coalition and to Sigma Delta Chi. I keep calling it Sigma Delta Chi. I know it's SPJ, but I'm a life member of Sigma Delta Chi. And so You'll excuse me if I think of that in that term. Oh, what I am really impressed with at this meeting and from the various speakers is how much this whole area has grown and how diverse the people who are interested in open government has become. I recall back in 1954, when I was covering the legislature as a reporter, I joined forces with who then was the AP bureau chief in Minneapolis and St. Paul, up at the legislature, and we began working on trying to improve the access to government meetings. It took us 3 years, and we finally managed to get through the open meeting law. And what struck me today was that at that time, there was only Jack McKay, the bureau chief, myself, and a couple members of SDX committee who were interested in this subject. We managed to convince a few legislators that open meetings ought to be open to the public. And we also stressed that this was not a should not be a media right. It should be a citizen right. There were people there, legislators I remember, who insisted that, well, they were willing to have meetings open to the media, but they didn't want that broad coverage by the public. And we convinced them that that wasn't a good idea, and our approach down the line was openness for the citizen, not just for the press. And I'm happy to say that that has been followed pretty closely. Enforcement, that's another question. I remember when we developed the Open Records Act, the Data Practices Act, again, the idea was that the record should be available to the press. Our feeling was that it had to have an openness, that the government had to require that any of the information it collected had to be available to the public without exception. But the legislature decided, well, there might have to be some exceptions. And so they adopted a few exceptions. There was a 3-page law that was created. Today it is 155 pages. That's unacceptable. And Gary, you were absolutely correct. You need a mechanism to really force the legislatures, people in power, to come out and really show what kinds of information ought to be restricted, must be restricted, and demonstrate the need for that, instead of allowing governmental agencies to put in a request for closing it because it might hamper their operations a little bit. I'm so happy to see, and I endorse everything you were talking about, Gary. We do need a new mechanism. I endorse your principles, and I hope that I will be around to see them implemented. Thank you again.